There are two scenarios when it is appropriate to use a colon. The first is before items in a series. Now there's two tests that you can conduct to see if it is appropriate to use a colon before items in a series. The first is check to see if you can replace a colon with the word namely. The second test is to make sure that there is a complete sentence before the colon, or an independent clause. If the scenario fails either of these tests, then most likely you should not use a colon in that instance. So this example sentence says, I enjoy playing many sports, basketball, volleyball, and baseball. So notice there's a colon before the items in a series. So let's see if we can replace the colon with the word namely. I enjoy playing many sports, namely basketball, volleyball, and baseball. That makes sense. That sounds grammatically correct, so it passes that test. And then we need to make sure all these words before the colon make up an independent clause. And an independent clause is just a group of words that can stand alone. I enjoy playing many sports. That can stand alone. That could be a sentence by itself. So it passes both of those tests, so we know that it's appropriate to use a colon here. Generally, if it passes one of these tests, then it's going to pass the other as well. The second example says, be sure to bring a pencil, paper, and a calculator. Now, should we use a colon here? Because we have items in a list, so we could put a colon right there. Now, could we replace that colon with the word namely? Be sure to bring namely a pencil, paper, and a calculator. That doesn't sound grammatically correct, so we shouldn't put a colon there. And then if you wanted to look at the second test as well, you could notice that be sure to bring is not an independent clause. So in this case, you don't need to use a colon, and the sentence is grammatically correct without one. Now, the second instance in when it's okay to use a colon is between two independent clauses. Now, this is not a very common way to use a colon, but nevertheless, it is still an appropriate way to use one. So if you have two independent clauses, you can join them with a colon. And so again, an independent clause is a group of words that can stand alone. So Caitlin can cook many desserts is a sentence, and she can make cookies, brownies, and cakes is a sentence. So they're both independent clauses that we're joining with a colon. And so this is an appropriate case in which to use one. But again, you're usually not going to see this. Usually there would just be a period here, or maybe a semicolon, or maybe a comma and some type of conjunction. So those are the two times to use a colon, with items in a series or between independent clauses.
Allusion. Allusion is an uncited but recognizable reference to something else. Usually, it's going to be a reference to something else in literature. Authors use allusions to make their own text richer. When an author uses an allusion, it gives their own writing the same significance or context that the allusion had. Let's look at some examples. Martin Luther King Jr. started his I Have a Dream speech by saying 50 years ago. This is a clear allusion to President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Lincoln started with fourscore and 7 years ago. So, even though Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't saying the exact same thing, he started out with 50 years ago, which is similar enough that people knew he was alluding to President Lincoln's speech. This reminded people of the significance of the event. And in reminding people of the significance of the Gettysburg Address, it lent significance to the speech that Martin Luther King was making. Let's look at some other examples. Scrooge. If someone is alluded to as Scrooge, or there's a Scrooge reference in writing, it's going to be someone who is not very generous. They're kind of miserly. They don't like to share. And that would be something that you would have seen in A Christmas Carol, where he goes around and sees what his life would be like if he weren't there and realizes to change his ways. But Scrooge was a very miserly man who didn't want to share with people who really needed it. If you see Pinocchio, It's a reference to someone who is lying. If you see a Trojan horse, it means someone who, or something that is a trick. It looks like the real thing, but really there's a trap concealed inside. An Achilles heel is a reference to Achilles from Greek mythology, and his heel was his one weak spot. So your Achilles heel would be your weak spot, where someone could really get to you. A Romeo from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo would be someone who was really good with women, someone who really loved to, take girls out on dates and was really good at, getting girls to go out on dates with them. Turn the other cheek is a biblical reference when Jesus told people that they shouldn't seek revenge, but should instead turn the other cheek if they're slapped once. Turn the other cheek so you can get hit on the other side of your face. And it's just his metaphor for saying, don't seek revenge. That's not the Christian way. Solomon is another biblical reference. He was a very wise king. So if you're referred to as someone who's like Solomon, it means you've got a lot of wisdom. And a Good Samaritan is another biblical reference, and it refers to the Good Samaritan on the road who helped someone when no one else would. So a Good Samaritan today is someone who helps people or helps a person that no one else is trying to help. So allusions can be used to ground text in a particular time or place, or they can use a cultural reference to make readers feel included. There are lots of reasons that a writer would use allusions, but every time that you use an allusion, it's meant to make your text richer and give your text more than it had before. So when you're reading, watch for allusions, and if you see one of these references, say to yourself, oh, that's an allusion. I learned about those. It's here to make the text richer. And think to yourself, what connotations do you get? How do you feel differently reading that word in the text? What did that word or reference do for your interpretation of the text? Because really, that's what allusion is there for. It's to add to the text and make it better. Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now, when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you could look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now, another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna. An egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green feathered bird, well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay, we were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky, unfamiliar word. Drafting a thesis statement. The thesis statement expresses the main idea of a composition. It should encompass every idea, detail, and argument in that one thesis statement. It should all relate in some way to the thesis. So your thesis isn't going to list out all of your arguments and details that you're going to have in your composition, but it should relate in some way to all of them. A thesis can be kind of tricky because you want it to be general enough to encompass everything that's going to be in your paper, but specific enough that the reader knows what your main idea is. It should be a short declarative statement, but it should not be vague. It needs to be specific. It can't just be a general subjective sentence that doesn't really tell the reader what's going on. The thesis statement should suggest the content of the rest of the piece so the audience knows what to expect. And if you're too vague, the audience isn't going to know what to expect. So you have to be specific without being too specific, and general without being too general. So I'll give you a few examples so you can see how to balance these things and draft an effective thesis statement. The principal is basically a nice guy. It tells you the principal's nice, but there are lots of things you could talk about that would make the principal a nice guy. This is a pretty vague statement, so let's improve upon that. Let's get more specific and give the reader more of an idea of what the content of your piece is going to be. The principal's policies demonstrate his care for students. So now, the reason we think he's a nice guy is because it's obvious that he cares for his students based on his policies. So we're not talking about the principal being a nice guy because he coaches Little League or he just says hi to you in the hallway. It's because he has policies at school that show that he cares about his students. So this is an effective thesis statement. This is a good one. This one is too vague. We had to get more specific. So let's look at another example. Dogs are good pets. Well, not everyone's going to think that, but at least if you give them more information, they may see your side of things. Saying dogs are good pets is still really vague. You need to get more specific. Why do you think they're good pets? But don't get too specific because you want your main idea to be in your thesis statement, but you don't want all the supporting details to be there. You want to save those for the body of your paper. So let's look at this as if this is an effective thesis statement example, changing dogs are good pets, which is still too vague, to something more effective. Because of its sense of loyalty, its ability to be trained, and its good companionship, a dog is the perfect pet for me. Now, this thesis does actually tell you what your main subtopics are probably going to be. You'll probably have a body paragraph talking about a dog's sense of loyalty, another one about how easy they are to train, and another one about how they are good companions. This kind of thesis statement is also okay because it gets specific, but not too specific. It tells what your subtopics are going to be, what your supporting overall ideas are going to be, but it doesn't get into every detail and argument that you're going to present in your composition. So this would be another good example. So one of the main things to remember when writing your thesis statement is to include the main idea of your paper, let the reader understand what they should expect from the rest of your paper, but don't be too vague or too specific. Try to focus on a short declarative statement that tells the overall idea of your paper without giving it all away. Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, That's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as, it just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say, this was this, or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water. Those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl. but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading. Historical context. Historical context can impact literature in a number of ways. The author's writing can be impacted by the historical period during which it was written, or the historical setting of the story. For instance, when Charles Dickens was writing, he was writing during a period where authors were paid by the word, which meant that his novels were very, very long. And that was the result of the time period during which his work was written. He was writing long novels because he knew he would get paid more for every word that he wrote. Dialect is something else you can pay attention to. The dialect could be what the author is used to using in his everyday life, or the dialect could be more related to the historical setting of the story. So dialect is something you want to pay attention to and ask yourself, is this the dialect used during the setting, or is this more of just the author using his own personal dialect that he's used to? Another thing to pay attention to with historical setting is major events that are going on. You want to be familiar with the time period during which a story is set so you can have a better understanding of it. So, one example is the Civil War. During the Civil War, slavery was the normal thing in the South. And whenever the Civil War is over, lots of slaves, or people that used to be slaves, wanted to tell their story. And so what came about were slave narratives. And these painted a picture of what slave life was actually like during that time. It was an actual account from that time period. And it kind of also told the relationship between slaves and slaveholders. So that source of writing is very valuable, and it's become one of the most important literary genres for African American writers. Today, people may still write from that perspective in that time period, but the actual slave narratives that gave first-hand accounts were very important. Another thing to pay attention to with Civil War writing, slave narratives, anything from that time period are the themes. A lot of times you'll see themes of power, race, inequality. Because when slavery ended, it was because people were saying, your skin color doesn't make you more or less of a person or a better or worse person. Everyone's equal. And while equal rights didn't come about till later, it started that theme of equality around the Civil War time. Another major event that's common is World War II. There are countless novels based around World War II events, whether it's based in Nazi Germany, whether it's based in America, as people are dealing with what was going on here. But one of the biggest things that you'll see is the topic of genocide, destroying a whole race. So your Jewish Nazi relations, you're going to see a lot of. Anne Frank, very, very popular book, one that most people are going to know about, was based on this. And if you know the World War II era, then you know what to expect when you're reading. You know that the Nazis are trying to take over most of Europe. You know that the Jews are being persecuted, and you've already got that bit of background knowledge before you even read the rest of the book. And with World War II novels, you're again going to see themes of race, power, and democracy, because in the end, people were going to say that having a government where some totalitarian dictator took over everything wasn't the best way to be. And you're going to see people highlighting the pros of democracy. So whenever you're reading, really pay attention to the historical context of the story, because the historical period during which it was written is always going to have an impact, and the historical setting is going to be very important for you to understand so that you can understand why the author gave the character certain motivations and why the author carried out the plot as they did. Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So, knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed, and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor, but because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed, or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the author explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence. Interpretation of expository or literary text. Well, to determine what your interpretation of a work is going to be, first let's refresh ourselves on what expository and literary text are. Expository writing is going to be something that informs, explains, or describes. It's going to be very cut and dry. There's not a plot. It's basically there to explain something to you, tell you how to do something, give instructions. A science research paper would be an example. Baking instructions for baking a cake. Anything like that would be expository. So what you want to do is outline the basic elements of that paper, and then you want to evaluate their effectiveness. This is how you are going to give your interpretation. Once you outline the basic elements of the research paper or the recipe, then you can evaluate their effectiveness. Did you learn what you were supposed to learn from the research paper? Are you now able to bake a cake following those directions? Very cut and dry. Literary is a little bit different. Literary works are going to be your narratives, essays, works of fiction. These are going to have a plot. There's going to be more that you will have to go through, and because there will be so much more to the literary works, you want to focus on just one aspect to give your interpretation. You don't want to try to cover all of the elements because that would be too much and you wouldn't really get to put your personal interpretation on all of the different aspects of that work. So, some aspects you could choose from are the topic of the story, major characters in the story, major events, the setting, structure, point of view, use of language, or tone. Any of these would work. Pick one, focus on that one, and what you're going to do is explained here. An interpretation should both describe the text and elaborate upon it. So, say we were to choose major characters. You would want to describe what's in the text and elaborate upon it. And I've put that into a few steps here for you. So, to describe the text, introduce the major characters. In your interpretation, describe the major characters. What do they look like? What are their attitudes? How has the author described them in the text? Then, explain how the author portrays them. Are they liked by other characters? Are they meant to be a villain or a hero? Are they just an everyday Joe? How does the author portray these characters? And then discuss what the author's purpose was. Why did the author portray them that way? What did the author want to get across to readers? And because this is an interpretation, there are going to be several different answers. There's no one right answer because no one is going to know exactly what the author's purpose was. You're giving your interpretation, what you think the author meant. So you'll describe everything that the author put in the book about the characters, and then you'll elaborate upon what the author put in there by telling what you think the author was trying to tell, what the author's theme was, what their purpose was for showing characters in a certain light. So when you are interpreting a text with expository, you want to remember to just outline the basic elements and evaluate their effectiveness. Were you able to bake that cake? Did you learn what you were supposed to from the research paper? With literary works, you want to focus on one aspect. Out of all the different things you could focus on in a literary text, pick one, just one, and then describe that one from the text, what the author actually said, and elaborate upon it. Go through and give your opinion on it, what you think the author meant. And the thing is, it's an interpretation. Everyone's is going to be a little different. Not everyone's going to pick the same aspect to focus on, and not everyone's going to elaborate upon it the same way. So since the author knew he was writing to lots of different readers whenever he or she created this work, try to make your interpretation unique.
A comma is there for the purpose of breaking the flow of text. So basically we could define the job of commas as to break the flow of text. So commas should come in places in sentences where we would naturally pause if we were speaking that sentence. And so one way to test whether or not a comma is necessary is to pause very deliberately at each comma when reading. Because it's important not to overuse commas because they lose their effect if they're used in places that they should not be. So it's important to know when commas are needed and when they're not needed, both for your own writing and maybe if you're revising someone else's work. So let's practice. Right here we have a sentence that says, as you can see, the car is very old. But we have a comma right here. So if you're just reading this to yourself inside your head, you may have trouble determining whether or not the comma is needed. So try reading it out loud and deliberately stopping at the comma. As you can see, the car is very old. Well, that makes sense because if you were speaking this, you would be explaining to someone and you would say, as you can see, the car is very old. So the comma there is needed. Another example is this sentence right here. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So here we have 3 commas. We actually have 4 commas. And so 2 of these commas are there for the purpose of setting off this phrase, and the other 2 commas are there because we're making a list. So first, let's take a look at the phrase. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So really, we could omit everything in between these 2 commas and just say natural disasters are not very common here. So that's why we're using commas here, because we could set this off. But if you were speaking this, you would say natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So both of those commas are needed. Now, when you're reading the list, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, you don't really need to pause in between each item in the list. But here, the commas aren't here as much to break the flow of text. In this case, they're just distinguishing between the different items in the list. So this is kind of an exception of when you wouldn't follow the rules of commas are only there to break the flow of text. But in general, hopefully you can see kind of a better idea of when to use commas. So where the check marks are, those were all the correct places to use commas, and then right there and right there as well. You just want to make sure that you use commas when you need them, and if in doubt, then generally leave the comma. But many times you want to leave out commas when you can because they slow down your writing, because someone feels like they need to mentally pause. If they're speaking, they need to actually pause when reading that comma. And so make sure your comma usage is appropriate.
Recursive writing process. The writer is constantly improving his or her work. While you're writing, you are going to constantly be trying to make that paper better that you're writing. The normal steps in the writing process are pre-writing, then writing or drafting, then editing, then proofreading, and finally presenting. Now, you may not read your paper aloud, but when you present it to someone else to read, then that is the presentation stage. So in pre-writing, you're going to be doing all of your outlining, you're going to list any ideas you have, you're going to get as much information down as you can. Then in writing, you're going to be actually writing out complete sentences in paragraph form so that you can kind of decide how you want to arrange your paper. In editing, you can move paragraphs around if you felt like maybe your 3rd paragraph should move to the 1st paragraph. However you wanted to do that, any sentences that you thought, oh, I could add some more to this, I could put more information here, I could take this out and put it in a different paragraph, any kind of revisions like that are in editing. In proofreading, you're looking for correct spelling, correct grammar, making sure that your sentences are punctuated correctly, you don't have any run-ons or fragments. And then presenting, again, is either saying, okay, I'm ready for you to read this, or reading it aloud, or if you wrote a play, having them act it out, or if you were writing a screenplay for a movie, having someone read that out. So the presentation stage is basically just saying, okay, what I wrote is complete, I'm ready for someone else to experience it. However, authors do not follow these steps exactly, because writing is a complex activity. When you are writing, you may be in the writing stage, writing out those paragraphs, writing complete sentences, getting everything organized the way you want, and you may catch a spelling mistake. But spelling mistakes are supposed to be caught and corrected in the proofreading stage. Now, why would you wait to correct the spelling mistake until later? If you catch it now, fix it now. And it's okay that you're doing it out of order. You will go through all of these stages during your writing process to make sure that you catch any problems that you've missed. But if you happen to see something you want to fix and you're in the writing stage, or you see a spelling mistake and you're in the editing stage, that's okay. Or if you're already back here in proofreading and you say, the more I read this, I really think that I should move paragraph 3 up to paragraph 2 and 2 down to 3. I really think they'd be better if I reversed the order. You can still do that even though you're not in the editing stage anymore. That's fine. If you're in pre-writing and you're already writing sentences, that's fine too. Writing is complex and everyone's not going to go in the normal order of steps whenever they're writing. Now, you do want to make sure that you go through each step because you don't want to miss something in your paper and present something that isn't 100% ready to be presented. So this is the recursive writing process. Recursive writing means generally following those normal steps, but improving the piece constantly. So the main goal is to improve your writing to make it the best that it can be. So you're going to be generally following the normal steps up here, but improving the piece constantly no matter what stage you are on. So if you are on writing and you need to do some proofreading, or if you're on proofreading and need to do some editing, it's okay to move around between the stages because writing is a complex activity. So when you're writing, don't think that you have to go in this order and you can't correct anything out of order or revise anything if you're past the revision stage. Make sure that you're always trying to make your writing the best it can be. Theme. Theme is the overall idea of a piece of literature. So think about the lesson or moral of the story that the author is trying to get across to you. One thing to remember is do not confuse theme with plot. Plot is what the characters do. It's the action of the story. It does not have to do with the overall lesson or message that the author is getting across. Now, obviously, what the characters do is going to help you understand the theme, but plot and theme are not the same thing. Plot is going to be more about human nature, society, and life in general. There can also be more than one theme. The author may have one overall message, but there may be a few messages in there, or you may be able to find more than one theme besides the main controlling theme of the story. Some questions to ask yourself are, what is the lesson or message? And some common themes are, man struggles against society, man struggles against nature, overcoming adversity, the importance of family and friendship, man struggles with faith, sacrifices bring rewards, and honesty is the best policy. So for all of these, I want us to look at the story of the tortoise and the hare from Aesop's Fables. And this shows you that there can definitely be more than one theme for one story. Now, all of these may not be what Aesop had in mind when he was coming up with this fable, but I was able to see all of these themes in the story. The last one, I couldn't come up with something for, but I've got a good one for that as well. So, man struggles against society. You've got this tortoise who feels like he's going to keep going and he's going to try to win the race, but all of society is against him and saying, oh, that hare has got you beat. He's way faster than you. I don't know why you think you're fast enough to beat him. So I'm sure that tortoise was struggling against society's views of him. Another one would be man struggle against nature. The tortoise is struggling against the nature of his self, how he's made. He's obviously not going to be as fast as the hare. He's going to have to go up hills. He's going to be fighting against the very nature of his self, where the hare is made to go much faster. Overcoming adversity. Just simply winning the race, the tortoise ended up winning even though no one expected him to do it. Even though people were probably telling him, oh, you can't do that. The hare's always going to beat you. The importance of family and friendship. Now, I've talked a lot about society, telling the tortoise he couldn't do this, but I'd like to think that the tortoise had some family and friends on his side that were urging him on, that helped him feel like he could actually go through and win this race. Man struggles with faith. The tortoise had to have faith in himself. The hare was very, very cocky. He felt like he had this race won, so much so that he went and took a nap, where the tortoise didn't do that. He had faith in himself and knew that he could do this if he just kept going, if he gave it his all. And then sacrifices bring rewards. The tortoise sacrificed that nap that the hare took, and in the end he won the race because he just kept going. Now, the moral of the story they give you is slow and steady wins the race, but I can see all of these themes in that story. Now, honesty is the best policy. I couldn't really come up with one for, but you can always look at Pinocchio. Pinocchio, every time he told a lie, his nose grew. It was not a good thing. Every time he lied, something bad happened to him. I won't ruin the whole story for you, but everyone knows about the growing nose, which is a sad punishment for someone who is not using honesty. So it's showing you honesty is the best policy. So whenever you're reading a story, you can look at what the characters are doing to figure out what the plot is, but remember the theme is different. The theme is going to be the controlling idea in that piece of literature. And you want to ask yourself, what is the lesson or moral the author is trying to get across to me?
Readers must always be conscious of the difference between a fact and an opinion. So first we need to define what a fact and what an opinion is. So a fact can be proved or disproved. In other words, a fact can be subjected to analysis. However, an opinion cannot be subjected to an analysis. An opinion may not be alterable by research because an opinion is just the author's personal feelings. So this sentence right here says the distance from New York to Boston is about 200 miles. So this right here is a fact because this can be proven or disproven. Now, although this isn't very specific because it uses the word about, it still is a fact. You could look at a map and see that the distance from New York to Boston is about 200 miles. Now, the sentence New York is too crowded is stated almost like a fact, but it is still an opinion because there is no objective way to measure overcrowding. And so many times an opinion will be indicated by words like believe, think, or feel. Now, in this case, New York is too crowded. We don't see any of those words, so it's stated like a fact. But you have to, as a reader, have to evaluate this sentence and realize that this cannot be proved or disproved. You have to realize that it's just the author's personal feelings. Now, many times, an opinion will be supported by facts. So an example would be the author gives the population density of New York as a reason for why it is overcrowded. And now an opinion supported by facts tends to be more convincing. However, that doesn't make it a fact even though the writer might back it up with a fact. It's still an opinion. It's still the author's personal feelings. Now, like I said, an opinion supported by a fact tends to be more convincing. But when authors support their opinions with other opinions, the reader is unlikely to be moved.
When we think about narratives, stories, things like this, they're often told from a particular point of view. And various methods and points of view are used to help tell stories, to bring across narratives, things like this. And so we're just going to talk briefly about what we mean literarily and otherwise by point of view. Point of view is a mental position from which events and things are viewed. The mental position from which events and things are viewed. Now, the point of view of a story can be one of three at least, and so we've got several types up here. The first type would be first person point of view. A first person point of view is a character in the story who speaks in the first person voice. If you've read anything by George R.R. Martin, his Storm of Swords, Clash of Kings, the whole Iron Throne saga, he uses this a lot. So each chapter is headed by the name of the character, and then that character narrates events from a first person point of view, what they see, what they think, what they're doing, and that helps move the story along, but purely from a first person standpoint, that person's point of view as they speak about themselves, their feelings, their motivations, and what they see around them. So first person is the first type of point of view within a story. Second is third person objective. Third person objective. And that last word is critical there. What we mean by a third person point of view is there is someone removed from the action, a third person, a narrator if you will, who is describing things that are happening out there. But that last word makes the critical difference. So in a third person objective point of view, the narrator, not a character in the story, speaks in the third person voice and tells only what is observable through the five senses. Tells only what is observable through the five senses. What's heard, what's seen, smelled, experienced, but nothing internal to anyone else or anything else. Only what that third person view can see objectively. Then there is finally point of view third person omniscient. Third person omniscient. What this means is you've got a narrator, once again, not a character in the story, who speaks in the third person voice and can tell and reveal the thoughts and the feelings of characters within the story. They know things that are not immediately observable on the surface. All of these are beneficial to be necessary to move a story forward, to help a narrative move along. But being able to distinguish those things, I think, is important. What point of view is the story being told from? Is it from the first person? Is it third person but only objective, only what can be seen with the five senses or experienced with the five senses? Or is it third person omniscient because the narrator, not a person in the story, is describing feelings and hidden things, thoughts that would not be obvious on the surface? As you're analyzing any sort of narrative or story, these sorts of things can be beneficial to understanding it better. And if you're writing your own story, then obviously you need to be making decisions. Do I want to write this particular part from a first person point of view, third person point of view objective, third person point of view omniscient, or where? What's going to move the story forward best? What do I need to communicate to the person who's wanting to read my story? Things like that. So anyway, just a basic overview of point of view, how important it is within narratives, and a basic breakdown of some of those different types. If you'd like to learn more about this and related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to a website with that information. And while you're there, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download. In this video, we want to go over prefixes. Prefixes are short little sections of words that come before the root of a word and help you understand what the word means. They add an extra nuance to the word. And why prefixes and suffixes, for that matter, are important, prefixes coming before the root of the word, suffixes, short little endings after the word, is that if you know your basic prefixes and suffixes, they help you determine the meaning of a word. And they're important clues, especially if you're taking a standardized test where they say we want you to find the word with the opposite meaning. Sometimes just knowing the prefix can give you enough of a clue, even if you don't know what the root means, to find the opposite. We've got a few examples on the board and we want to go through those briefly just to show you the importance of prefixes, how they can help you in your test-taking strategies, and how they can help you understand the meanings of words. So prefixes give clues as to a word's meaning. Knowing them can help you find the word with the opposite meaning on a test. So words like prefixes like pre. Here we think pre-operative, pre-op. That means before the operation. Or prescient. Pre meaning before, and scient from the word science, which means knowledge. So to know ahead of time. So prescient is to know ahead of time. Pre-game show, the part that comes before the game. So pre means before. The opposite of pre is post. Post-operative care, the care that happens after the operation. Post-game show, the show that happens after the game. So pre is before, post is after. If you realize this opposites, then if you see a word that's got a prefix on it, then you look for a word with a post prefix on it if the test is asking you to find the opposite. Another thing would be pro and d. So pro means for, as in pro-life. Someone who is pro-life is for life. De is the negation, so deconstruction. To deconstruct is the opposite of, or the negation of construction. Construction to build up, deconstruct to destroy. So pro meaning for, de is usually a negation, pre before, post after. Knowing your prefixes can be critical, especially if you're not sure of the whole word. You can say, well, let me break this word up into its prefix, its root, and its suffix, and see if I can't decode just from that minimal information the proper answer on the other side. Now, obviously, when you're taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with the right answer. But if you're struggling, if you're not sure, this is a strategy you can use. You can look at the word, break it down, and say, here's the prefix, and I know it means this, and I'm being asked to find the opposite. What's the opposite of this prefix? Then I've got my answer more than likely. Caution though, caution. Con and pro are opposites, but congress is not the opposite of progress, although some people might disagree. That's more of a joke in terms of Congress being the opposite of progress, but con and pro are opposites, but you have to know and be careful sometimes. Anyway, that's been just a basic introduction and overview of the importance of prefixes as a test-taking strategy of knowing what they mean to help you determine the meaning of a word, and also to assist you if you're being asked to look for the opposite. If you know what the prefix means and you know what the opposite of that prefix is, it makes it a snap to find the right answer. If you'd like to learn more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information. While you're on that website, you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Pronouns replace nouns. This sentence says, Dad is at his office. We could also say, he is at his office. These two sentences have the same meaning because he replaces dad, but they're both talking about the same person. Now, when dealing with pronouns, you have something called an antecedent. An antecedent is the noun that a pronoun replaces. So here, dad is the antecedent, because later we have this pronoun he, which replaces dad. Now there are many pronouns, so I'm going to go ahead and list most of those. I, you, he, she, it, we, they, me, you, him, her, it, us, them, my, your, his, her, its, our, their, mine, yours, his, hers, ours, theirs, myself, herself, ourselves, and himself. So those are a list of pronouns that you're probably pretty familiar with. So notice here, his is also a pronoun. So dad is the antecedent for both his and he. Now, why do we use antecedents? Why don't we just always use that noun? Well, take a look at this example. Tom plays soccer. Tom is very athletic. It's kind of redundant or annoying to say Tom every time. So instead, we can replace Tom, which is now an antecedent, for he. Tom plays soccer. He is very athletic. Because we just mentioned Tom, we know who he is talking about. Now again, you always need an antecedent, because if we said he plays soccer, he is very athletic, we don't know who he is. So you need an antecedent. You need that noun first, and then from there, you can use pronouns. Now as soon as you talk about someone else, as soon as you use a new noun, you need to use that noun again before you use a pronoun. So we could say, Tom plays soccer. He is very athletic. Sam plays soccer too. Now, if we were to say, he likes basketball, then who would he stand for? He right here is is a pronoun. And so what's the antecedent? Are we talking about Sam or are we talking about Tom? Most likely, people are going to think you're talking about Sam because that's the last noun you used. So if you were talking about Tom, then you would need to actually use his name right here. So pronouns only work as long as there is only one noun in the picture. As soon as you use a new noun, you need to use that old noun again before you can use an antecedent. Now look at this sentence. People should wash its cars. You want to make sure your pronouns agree with your noun. You want to make sure they agree with their antecedent. So here, people is the antecedent. Its is the pronoun. But they chose the wrong pronoun here. This should say their cars. Because when we use the word its, that's a singular form. It's like they're referring to one person. But here, since we're talking about people, we're talking about lots of people, or more than one person, we need to use the pronoun their because that's plural. That refers to more than one person. So again, that's a quick look at pronouns. And pronouns replace nouns. Characters are an essential part of every story. So characters can be classified into two main categories, flat and round. The terms flat and round pertain to how much the character changes throughout the story. So flat characters have little change in personality throughout the story, or many times no change in personality. They're very predictable. They're always the same. And because they're predictable, they can be considered not very interesting. So that's why they play small roles in the story. The main characters of a story are never going to be flat characters. Instead, they're going to be round characters, because round characters incur lots of change throughout the course of a story. So they play the main roles. So flat characters and round characters both contribute a lot to a story. Obviously, round characters are needed to play the main roles because they're going to be developing and changing a lot, and that's what moves the plot along. The plot is moved along by changes in characters' personalities. Flat characters are also needed, however, because they play the smaller roles in the story, the supporting roles that make the main characters very interesting. So when we're talking about round characters, you probably heard me use the word development. And that's what authors try to do with round characters. They try to develop the characters, and it's the development of the characters that moves the plot along. If the characters stay the same, throughout the entire story, then the plot's not very interesting because the plot's not going to progress very much. So round characters are essential to moving the plot along. But the important thing to take away from this, if you remember one thing, is that characters can be split up into flat characters and round characters. Flat characters having the same personality and round characters changing in personality throughout the story. When it comes to summarizing text, you need to be able to state the main point of a story. So a summary is just stating the main point of a story. So you're reading an entire story, and then you're just taking the important things and writing about that. If you've ever looked at the back of a book, you'll see a summary on the back of a book. And so there's a whole book that may be 100 or 200 pages, but the author summarizes it on the back of the book so that you get an idea of what it's about. So that's what you're trying to do through a summary. So there's 4 main points that you should remember when writing a summary. Focus, like I already said, on the main idea of the story. Focus on the key points. In other words, you're not worried about little details. You're worried about the important things that contribute to the overall storyline. The third point is focus on the conclusion of a story. Because in most stories, there's some kind of problem. The whole plot is based around some kind of problem throughout the story. Then eventually that problem is resolved. And so that happens in the conclusion of the story. So look at the conclusion of the story and talk about that too in your summary. So you're going to be talking about the main idea of the story, the key points, the problem, maybe a little bit about the main character, and then talk about the end of the story and how the character ended up dealing with his or her problem. Then the fourth point is kind of a longer one. Focus on important information the author wants the reader to know. So throughout the story, you may notice certain points that the author really wants the reader to understand. And so look for that important information and include that in the summary as well. And so a summary is typically one paragraph in length. So it's not very long because it does not need to be long because you're not focusing on details, you're just focusing on the overall story. And so remember, again, you're looking for important information. And so we're not interested in details. Try not to even think about the details, just look for the main idea of the story. Now, in some cases, you might be writing a summary for a long story with multiple settings and scenes. And so a summary may be a few paragraphs in length, and these paragraphs give the main points of each major part of the story. And so the summary of a long story always includes a conclusion to wrap up the story as an entirety. So like I said, the summary is usually going to be one paragraph, but if it's a really long story that has lots of different settings, lots of different scenes, lots of different problems throughout the plot, you may need to write a paragraph for each main point or major part of the story. And then for that summary, you're going to write a few paragraphs, and then you're going to write a conclusion that's going to kind of summarize that whole story. And so only make a summary longer than one paragraph if you feel like you cannot include all the important information in one paragraph. So again, a summary states the main point of a story. Understanding how words relate to each other can often add meaning to a passage. So it's important to understand synonyms and antonyms. Synonyms are words that mean the same thing, and antonyms are words that mean opposite things. So take, for example, the words dry and arid. Those words are synonyms because they pretty much mean the same thing. They have similar definitions. Now the words dry and wet are antonyms because they have opposite definitions. They mean the opposite thing. Now consider these words, friendly and collegial. We would consider these words synonyms. However, they do have slightly different meanings. Friendly means more on an intimate setting, just a friendship, whereas collegial means something more of like an academic or business relationship. However, we still say these are synonyms even though they have slightly different definitions. Because if two words had exactly the same definition, then we wouldn't need two different words. So it stands to reason that synonyms are still going to have slightly different meanings. Now sometimes words are so different that they cannot be synonyms, even though they are somewhat alike. Like, consider the words hot and warm. We would say, yes, these words are alike, but the definitions are different enough, we wouldn't call them synonyms. So, like, take this sentence, for example. He burned his hand on the hot stove. Now, if we said that hot and warm were synonyms, then we could replace hot with warm. And the sentence would say, he burned his hand on the warm stove. But that doesn't really make sense because you don't think of someone burning their hand on something that's warm. So as you can see, hot and warm mean similar things, but they are not synonyms because they are too different in meaning. So the important thing to take from this is that synonyms are words that have exact or similar meanings, and dry and wet are words that have opposite meanings. The narrator plays an important role in the story, and it's important that you as a reader understand the narrator. So a narrator can talk in first person or in third person. In first person, the narrator will use pronouns like I and me because they're talking about things they're experiencing and things they see happening. And in this case, the narrator will actually be a character in the story, so it's important to understand which character they are playing. In third person, the pronouns he and she are used because the narrator is looking onto the situation, saying, he did this or she did this. And so they're not a character in the story. So that's one thing you need to understand about the narrator. The second thing is how much does the narrator know? And you may be wondering why this is important. But some narrators are going to know what all the characters' thoughts are, and some narrators do not know that. And some narrators will be able to explain to the reader what's going on and their thoughts about it, and some narrators will just let the plot speak for itself. So how much the narrator knows influences how much the reader will know, because however much the narrator knows, they will then tell the reader that. So it's important to understand how much the narrator actually knows. It is important to use different types of sentences. Using different types of sentences adds variety to your writing. So by using different types of sentences, you make your writing more interesting. It's more appealing to the reader. So there's three types of sentences. There's the simple sentence, complex sentence, and the compound sentence. So you want to try to use all types of sentences in your writing. So a simple sentence is just a subject and a verb. This is what we'd call one independent clause. Hannah ran through the meadow. So we have the subject here, and we have the verb ran. And so that's all that's here. It's just a complete thought. It's enough to be a sentence, but it's not anything more. Then we have a complex sentence, which is an independent and a dependent clause. So I call this an independent clause because it can stand alone. It has a subject and a verb, so it's a sentence. It doesn't need anything else to make it more of a sentence. And so this says, instead of watching a movie, he read a book. So here we have a subject, he, and a verb, read. Now, he read a book could be a sentence alone. So that's the independent clause. The dependent clause is instead of watching a movie. Because instead of watching a movie isn't a sentence. I couldn't just come up to you and say, instead of watching a movie, you'd be thinking, okay, instead of watching a movie, what are you going to do? So this is the dependent clause. So together, the independent clause and the dependent clause form a complex sentence. And then we have a compound sentence, which is two independent clauses. So here we have the sentence, we ate burgers. So we have the subject we and the verb ate. And then we ate burgers, or then we ate dessert. So we have we as the subject and ate as the verb again. But these are two sentences. These are two independent clauses, because both of these clauses could be sentences by themselves. I could come up to you and say, we ate burgers, and that would be a complete thought. Or I could say, then we ate dessert. That would be a complete thought. So by joining these two together, we're forming one sentence, but we're forming one sentence out of what could be two sentences. So that's two independent clauses, which makes a compound sentence. So when you use all of these, it gives your writing variety. It makes your writing more interesting. And also, by using different types of sentences, it makes your sentence length differ as well. So generally, your simple sentences are going to be kind of short, and sometimes your complex or compound sentences will be pretty long. And so by having different lengths to your sentences, it makes your writing more interesting.